Plantation of Ulster of the early 17th century was an episode of huge significance in our history. It followed on from the flight of the Earls in 1607, and initially the government really didn't know what to do in the aftermath of the flight of the Earls, but over time a scheme of plantation was developed over the next number of years. So most of the planning for the plantation went on in London, and from about 1610 onwards the plantation scheme was rolled out through the grants of land to the various categories of landowner. So as a result of the plantation, 6 of Ulster 9 counties were given a systematic scheme of plantation, fairly systematic scheme of plantation. There were various categories of grantee. There were the English and the Scottish undertakers, so called because of the great undertaking they were about to embark on. There were servitors, that is, men who had served the Crown in Ireland in either a civilian or a military capacity. Many of them were former officers in the Elizabethan army. A proportion of land was set aside for the Irish. A proportion of land was set aside for the new Reformed Church, the Church of Ireland, and other portions of land were set aside for Trinity College in Dublin, for the new royal schools that were being established, and for some of the new corporate towns that were being developed in the plantation period. In terms of the proportion of land or quantity of land that would comprise the plantation, well, 6 counties, that is Donegal, Tyrone, Fermanagh, Armagh, Cavan, and a new county that was created, you might say, for the plantation, the county of Londonderry, so called because of the involvement of the London companies. And that county was really an amalgam of the old county of Coleraine, with part of County Antrim added in, part of County Donegal added in, and a large part of County Tyrone added into what's really now, you might say, the South Derry part of the county. So in total, several million acres were available for plantation and parcelled out to the various categories of grantee. Finding an official date for the commencement of the plantation is not easy, but certainly by 1610 the lands were allocated to the different grantees and formal grants began to be issued to those individuals. So many of the undertakers, the English and Scottish undertakers, received their patents, these land grants, these royal grants, allocating them certain lands. Many of those began to be issued in 1610. And settlers began to arrive from 1610, 1611 onwards. In some areas, very small numbers, and others, larger numbers of settlers were arriving on the newly created estates. The undertakers from both England and Scotland came from disparate backgrounds. Some of them were aristocrats, like the Earl of Abercorn, the Duke of Lennox, who received land grants in Tyrone and Donegal respectively. Others were from laird backgrounds, so minor landowners. In England it was a similar picture. Some were titled aristocrats, others were from gentrified backgrounds. How they were actually identified? Well, in some cases it was their relationship with the king himself. We know, for example, that the Earl of Abercorn received land grants at Strabane in County Tyrone, and he was a prominent figure at the Scottish royal court, a friend of the king, and the king actually personally identified him as someone who would be a suitable lord to take over lands in Ulster. So there is actually a letter referring to the fact that the Earl of Abercorn was induced by the king to become a planter in Ulster. So a range of different factors were at play in determining who was allocated lands, and particularly were allocated lands in certain districts. Generally speaking, what happened is that lands were organised by precinct or barony. So we're here in the precinct of Dungannon, and Dungannon was actually allocated to a combination of servitors and Irish, whereas not far from Dungannon we have the precinct of Mountjoy, and that was allocated to Scottish undertakers. Elsewhere in County Tyrone, well, the barony of Clogher was allocated to English, the barony of Omagh also to English undertakers, the barony of Strabane to Scottish undertakers. And so it was a similar picture across 5 of the 6 counties in Ulster, of 6 officially planted counties. The different county, of course, was County dairy or Londonderry, which was allocated to the London merchant companies. Well, for many years, the English administration in Dublin had grappled with the issue of bringing Ireland in its entirety under its control. And various stratagems had been pursued. The idea of surrender and regrant, so Irish lords would surrender their Irish titles and would be granted new titles under the crown. So the Lord of the O'Neills, for example, became the Earl of Tyrone. Now, these schemes had varying degrees of success, and ultimately, of course, it was the 9 Years' War that brought the entire island of Ireland under the control of the crown. Now, of course, by the time that the 9 Years' War actually ended, Queen Elizabeth was dead, and the new Scottish king was on the throne. James VI of Scotland was now James I of England and Ireland. And he, because of the fact that there was a Scottish king now on the throne, it of course inevitably meant that Scots would be very much involved in the plantation scheme. And not just simply moving in to set up home, but would be centrally involved and actually allocated formal grants of land as part of the plantation scheme. And James the Sixth and First was deeply interested in the plantation scheme. The plantation was seen as a way of pacifying and enriching the province of Ulster, of settling it with peaceable and loyal subjects. And those who devised the plantation had grand ideas about what it would actually achieve. The king himself did keep a careful watch on developments in Ulster, insofar as he was able to do from London, of course. But 4 major surveys of the plantation scheme were carried out between 1611 and 1622. And we know that the king was deeply interested and even concerned at the progress of the plantation, or maybe in some cases at the lack of progress in the plantation, as well as where new communities of Scots and Englishmen were being established. When we look at the pattern of the distribution of land grants, we can see the ways in which the English undertakers and the Scottish undertakers were kept together in certain precincts. On the other hand, there were other precincts or baronies that were allocated to a mixture of servitors who generally had military experience, an experience that was considered essential to the pacification of Ulster. And within those areas allocated to servitors, land grants were also made to the Irish. Now, as part of their land grants, the undertakers were required to build a fortification of a certain form on their lands. So depending on the size of the land grant, they either had to build a bawn, that is a fortified enclosure, or maybe a bawn and a stone castle on their lands as well, which was in many ways a source of strength, a place of refuge if need be, an important part of the landscape, an important indicator of the changing landscape and those who were now in ownership of the land. So in various ways, the government tried to ensure that there was a degree of stability and comparative peace in the province of Ulster. Well, under the formal plantation scheme in the 6 counties, that is the 6 officially planted counties, a total of 280 Irishmen and a few women received grants of land. However, for the most part, these grants were relatively small. In some cases, maybe only a townland or two. Only 26 of the Irish grantees were allocated estates of 1,000 acres or more. Now, it was part of the plantation plan. It was actually very clearly stated in the land grants to the undertakers, the English and Scottish undertakers, that they were not allowed to have Irish tenants on their lands. In fact, they were not allowed to have Irish at all on their lands. They were to be, the theory was they were to be systematically cleared from the lands of the undertakers. However, we know that by and large that did not happen. The reality was there were not enough settlers arriving on most of the estates to farm the land, to take up tenancies. And so the undertakers, in many instances, were perfectly happy, perfectly content to have Irish tenants on their lands, paying rents to them to graze ground or grow crops or pursue farming of various forms. So in theory, and this is one of the the problems with the plantation scheme. It's all very well coming up with a grand scheme in London. It's an entirely different matter trying to roll it out in the Ulster landscape. The theory was remove the Irish from the Undertakers' lands. The reality was they stayed on for the most part. There was, of course, a change in status for many of the Irish. Rather than being tenants to the new lords, over time they maybe dropped in status. They maybe became under tenants of the tenants as more settlers came in. So there were certainly huge changes for the Irish as a result of the plantation, huge changes in terms of their relationship with their lords, huge changes in terms of the new economy that was developing. Now, of course, in some instances, we can trace changes that were underway, and the plantation really accelerated those changes rather than necessarily introducing them. However, there's no doubt that for the Irish in the plantation, it brought huge changes, and for most of them, it was not for the better. Around about 1630, a muster was carried out in Ulster, and the muster roll produced listed adult males capable of bearing arms. And the names of over 13,000 men are listed in that muster roll, overwhelmingly of English and Scottish background. So the muster roll indicates at least 13,000 adult males across Ulster as a whole. Now, of course, there are significant gaps in the muster roll. There are some major estates in County Antrim, for instance, that were missed or left out, or maybe the information did not survive. So when you add in those figures, it would increase the numbers significantly in some cases. But we know there were at least 13,000 adult males in Ulster by 1630. We know that by about 1630, there were at least 13,000 adult males of English or Scottish, and a few instances of Welsh background in Ulster. When we look at the way the plantation developed from 1610 onwards, we do see really quite stark contrasts between areas where plantation is comparatively successful and areas where really it is a failure. The various undertakers who were allocated lands in 1610, the reality is that many of them gave up at a fairly early stage, sold out, went back to Scotland. Some never even came to Ulster. Or went back to England. So by the 1620s, what we find is the consolidation of estates. We see a number of individuals like Sir William Stewart, who gave his name to Newton Stewart, who acquire quite significant areas, fairly vast estates, both in Donegal and in Tyrone. And these developments were contrary to the original plan of the plantation. The idea was to have comparatively succinct, small estates in the hands of a larger number of landowners. Really what happens by the 1620s is that there are smaller number of estates in fewer hands. As one of the developments very much associated with the plantation is the emergence of an urban network in Ulster. Now, there had been urbanisation in Ulster before the plantation, but with the plantation, we see very much a concerted effort to create a new network of towns and villages. In fact, under the plans for the plantation, it was ruled that the settlers should actually live together in towns and villages, not scattered across the countryside. Again, that's an area where we have the theory of the plantation and we have the practice. The theory that settlers should live together in towns and villages. In reality, they did, for the most part, live scattered across the countryside. However, we do see a number of important towns developing. We obviously take the town of Derry, or Londonderry, develops as a major port of departure for goods being produced in the northwest, a major port of arrival for a range of manufactured products, as well, of course, as people coming in. We can see the same at the likes of Belfast and Newry and Coleraine and so on. Inland, we see the development of a number of market towns. Dungannon, of course, continues to be a place of huge importance in this part of County Tyrone. It had, of course, been the seat of the O'Neills prior to the plantation. Well, as part of the plantation scheme, Sir Arthur Chichester the Lord Deputy of Ireland, acquires Dungannon. And that isn't just coincidence. It wasn't just that he picked Dungannon out of a hat. His acquisition of Dungannon represented a very symbolic change from the power of the O'Neills to the new power of the administration. And Chichester, being the figurehead, the chief official in that administration, acquires Dungannon. And he does invest in Dungannon. He doesn't actually live here. He primarily lives, when he's Lord Deputy, he's primarily in Dublin, but he's got two important houses at Belfast and Carrickfergus. But still, Dungannon is important. And Dungannon develops into a formal nucleated settlement. It acquires new buildings, such as a townhouse, a new Protestant church built here in Dungannon. And Dungannon does rise to become one of the more important towns in Plantation Ulster. By the late 1630s, it seemed that the various accommodations needed for a functioning society were in the process of being worked out, that the plantation did seem to be bedding down. And we have the English and the Scots and the Irish. It didn't mean to say that they liked each other. There were fierce rivalries, there were intense enmities in many instances, but it seemed that a functioning plantation society was beginning to emerge. However, by the end of the 1630s, life for all sections of society across Ireland became increasingly difficult because of the policies pursued by the administration in Dublin. In October 1641, an uprising begins here in Ulster, led by some of the more important figures in the Irish community. Individuals like Sir Phelim O'Neill, who was the MP for Dungannon, a major landowner at what's now Caledon in County Tyrone, but someone who was concerned at developments in England and Scotland, political developments in those kingdoms, was concerned about the implications for the position of people like him in Ireland. And so an uprising takes place. The initial aim is to seize some places of importance, like Castle Caulfield, for instance, a show of strength from which to negotiate a new settlement. It doesn't work out like that, of course. The uprising spirals out of control. It results in massacres of settlers. It results in reprisals from the settler population who are organising themselves to defend their position. And as a result of that and the warfare that develops over the next decade, Ulster is devastated. Ireland as a whole is severely affected by this period of warfare. In the 1650s, the Cromwellians stamped their authority on Ireland. And as a result of the Cromwellian land settlement, Irish land ownership in Ulster is virtually wiped out. So the little that was land that was left in the possession of Irish lords was to a large extent removed from them. So there we have another situation where the position of the Irish top tier, you could say, is declining and then declines very sharply. We have the influx of further settlers. There's another period of severe instability around 1690 with the Williamite War, the Siege of Derry and the Battle of the Boyne and so on. And then in the 1690s, we see another fresh influx of settlers, mainly from Scotland, many of them fleeing severe famine conditions in Scotland, can be regarded in many instances as famine refugees. And as a result of that, the character of Ulster is changing and changing yet again. It's becoming more British in character, particularly Scottish. Now Scots are very much ahead of the English in terms of the settler population. And the position of the Irish is declining further. There's even more pressure on land. The Dublin administration, the Dublin Parliament, begins to pass laws aimed at restricting the rights and freedoms of the Catholic Church as an institution and individual Catholics as practicing their religion. So there are huge changes in the course of that 17th century. Major changes that changed the character of the province. And in 1600, Ulster as a province was still, for the most part, in the control of Gaelic lords. A century later, that leadership was completely gone. Of course, the population mix was still there, but there's a very changed situation in terms of who owned the land, the religion that was practiced, the development of towns and villages, the allocation of tenancies on the estate, the development of the economy and the society that existed by 1700.